Good morning, everybody. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to wait just a couple of seconds for folks to stream in, and we will get started. Hello, hello. All right. So, good morning, good morning. Okay. That's set up. We'll get going on that just momentarily. A couple of quick announcements. The pop culture blog is going to be due this weekend. All the instructions for that are going to go up today, but I've been talking about it a little bit for the past couple of weeks. So hopefully you have been thinking about a pop culture example. I'm just going to put that here real quick. So you'll see that, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more. Well, I'm going to put all the information up for that. I've got several examples for folks to look at as well. But that will go up. I already mentioned or you all already got the emails about the literature reviews. If you have not had a chance to look on Blackboard and view your submission, view the grading details, do that, because it will give you all of the inline edits, right? The line by line edits and feedback that we provided to you for your benefit, right? To help you give you more context for how to work on your writing, how to work on argument, how to any of those kinds of things, but not necessarily in a bad way, right? Like writing is an art. It takes practice. It takes tons and tons of work, right? And literature reviews, those strike fear into the hearts of even senior scholars. So, but they wouldn't do so if we learned how to deal with them and learned how to do them much sooner, which is part of the reason that I've assigned them, but also because you're doing an actual research project, so you actually have to use this component. So just keeping that in mind, please do look at the feedback. If you have questions after looking at the feedback or you want more information, email us, schedule time, all of those things, and definitely use the resources that I recommended. Okay, so the pop culture blog will be due on Friday. It is a blog entry. You can copy and paste it from a Word document, or you can, I believe you can also upload a Word document there. But it's going to be in sort of a blog format. So it's not informal or so casual that you shouldn't also be paying attention to how you're talking about things. But it is a little more public facing, a little more plain language, and a little more fun. So in terms of sort of tone of your writing, I have examples that I'll be putting up, several different examples, some of which are from Anthropology, an Anthropology blog that looks at popular culture issues or themes that are related to this particular pop culture blog assignment that you're going to have on Friday. And there are some others that are from a pop culture blog that isn't necessarily anthropological in its focus, but does do sort of scholarly, learned blog posts about popular culture. So you can peruse those sites as well. Once I, put up but the examples that I'm providing are sort of in the vein of what we are focusing on right now, which is race and racism and how representation happens in epistemology and all of those kinds of things. And so those are some of the themes that you'll be exploring in the pop culture blog this week. So, all right, now that so I'm going to post all of the instructions on the pop culture blog today. So you'll have those. And if you have further questions, you can email me and we can, but you can absolutely use the resources from the course. That's what you're supposed to do. You should not be going outside to get more resources for the pop culture blog. This is using the resources that we have been looking through in class to sort of answer a prompt about a pop culture scenario. So yeah, hopefully we'll get the rest of that information out. I'll get it out as soon as I can today. My goal is before noon so that you have it. And we're going to get cracking on our day. So, oh goodness. So we're talking about Shaquille McLean's article today. And they make some really important points, right? And you may have noticed, right? But we read last week some of the authors that McLean takes issue with, right? So this is part of scholarship as well, right? We argue with one another, we battle back and forth about these theories, and maybe it's not so dramatic as battling, right? But we go back and forth about these theories in order to try to better understand what's happening, right? And also to check ourselves and say, are we actually getting to the root of the problem, or are we still mired in some of these other situations that are perpetuating this problem? And so this is how McLean is taking on the issue of race and racism and trying to get at some of the things that we've been talking about in class, right? Really going back to epistemology and etiology, sort of how words come about, right? The historical context for words. So I'm going to pull up the, it's not a very dramatic PowerPoint this week by any means, but just to keep us sort of focused and have a reference point back so you can look at your notes and remember what we were talking about, right? So there are these debates in the literature about how best to look at race and racism. And for a long time, scholars like Omi and Winant have been sort of the authorities, right? But McLean has this idea that Omi and Winant haven't gone far enough. Essentially, they're still attaching, right, this idea of race, right? They're separating it from racism, which is one of the points that McLean is taking issue with. But they're still attributing it to these sort of essential factors about a person, right? About people, about groups of people, right? So McLean is trying to make some arguments here about ways that we might rethink this. So there are these deep connections to epistemology, right? How we know what we know. So traces all the way back to what we were talking about last week, right? Where this idea of race, the concept of race, right? The concept of biological race, or the concept of this fundamental difference based on appearance and presumed biology, which they go into a lot more detail on, started around the 1600s, and it was used as a way to justify, right, the subjugation of peoples who look different. What McLean adds to this conversation, right, is that it didn't just happen as a result of the discovery that there were Native Americans or that there were um, Africans, right? They make a very clear point that Europe was surrounded by all of these different people, right? And they had already been using these different tactics to subjugate and identify difference among people, right? So this wasn't something new in terms of power. And this is what McLean, one of the big things that McLean says is really missing from this discussion, right? It's this fundamental oversight, right? Overlooking the power structures. Now, there's a little bit, Omi and Winan are a little bit talking about the power structures, right? They're talking about racism. They're talking about these institutions of power like we talked about last week, right? So they don't think that this isn't an issue of power, but it's more complicated than that. And McLean is trying to point that out, right? That even the systems have systems, right? It's really involved. So instead of saying that race is this new idea, and race as a concept outside of distinguishing animals from one another, right? The new use of race as a way to categorize human beings or humanness is new in the context of etiology. Etiology, etiology. Remember that whole linguistic difference thing? Etiology, etiology. Just depends on where you're from and how you say things like that. But McLean wants to orient this conversation around the context and the ideas of settler colonialism. This is the bigger picture power structure, even than racism as a power structure, right? That's a power structure within this broader power structure, right? Settler colonialism is the sort of big picture. And this fits really with a theory that is trying to attend to building empires. This fits with a theory of accumulation by dispossession, which is accumulating wealth by dispossessing other people, right? Or dispossessing, removing people or obstacles from the accumulation of wealth, right? So it fits in also with a critique of capitalist endeavors, right? Which were really beginning to start in earnest with sort of globalized trade that began in the 16th and 17th century, so the 15 and 1600s, right? With global travel, with the attempt to build empires across not just national sort of localized boundaries, but really across continents, across the globe, right? So we have this context then of settler colonialism that McLean says, listen, this is why we're missing the point on race and racism, right? The point isn't that race is real, because it's not, which is what McLean is arguing, right? Yes, the social effects of race are real because we have made them real, but they exist, and they only exist in the context of settler colonialism, right? So there's no, if we don't get to the issue, this broader issue, right, of settler colonialism, then we're not actually going to be able to manage getting rid of the concept completely. So some of you are sitting here watching, listening, and thinking, yeah, but like, what do you mean get rid of race? So this isn't an argument, importantly, right? This is not an argument about color blindness or pretending that there isn't difference. McLean makes an argument, right, about the vast variation of human ecology, right? Who we are, right? All of these various differences, and not just variations among us, but within us, right? So that's not what's happening here. And McLean is not only trained as an anthropologist, but McLean is also trained as a biologist and an ecologist. So this is coming from a variety of perspectives. And if you have a chance, look up Shia McLean and their work and their sort of approach to undoing the concepts of race and racism, and especially biological racism, which is particularly insidious. But take a look at some of those things because they're really, really powerful, but I think also really really great examples and really well embedded in some of these foundational theories, but also take those foundational theories to task and push them further and say, listen, Omi and Wynant, for example, it's not enough to say that race isn't biological. It's not enough to say that, and it doesn't do anything to say that we can separate race from racism, because race and racism are always and forever part of the same thing. Race was created for the purpose of racism, pure and simple. Right? So it doesn't serve a better purpose. It doesn't serve a different purpose. That is why race was created. It was created as part of the system of this process of settler colonialism, right? As a tool of domination. Okay. So if you're following me, if you're getting it, right, we're gonna pop forward and try to figure out, now that we've pulled this string, and we're undoing the sweater. Now I've got Weezer's sweater song stuck in my head. That'll be fun. That'll be my theme while we're doing this, right? We're going to try to figure out how to imagine a world without race. Can you do it? Imagine walking into a room and describing your classmates. Can you do it without reference to their race? Can you do it without reference to their gender, for that matter? Right? Those are the kinds of thought experiments that would really serve you well in sort of unwrapping some of the assumptions in these ideas. Why is it that we use these markers, right? As Omi and Wynant call them, markers. And McLean doesn't argue that they're not markers, but they're not benign markers, right? What are the power systems that dictate and control these markers, right? And how are we perpetuating and giving more power to it by continuing to use those markers? Is there another way to imagine the world? Now, it's really complicated to think about, it's really difficult to imagine something that we have never known. It requires a great deal of creativity and imagination. And it requires a great deal of comfort suspending our disbelief, right? So, in order to do some of those things, we have to feel safe in the first place. Or theoretically, right? Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's not at all the case. But this is so I also study and teach social movements. And this is one of the biggest obstacles in the success of a social movement is how much imagination it has. So when I worked in Honduras, I I replay this conversation that I had with a young sort of would be political activist, maybe. He had dreams of changing the way things are in Honduras, right? When we talked. But I couldn't possibly call this person revolutionary because their goal was not to change the system itself. The goal was literally to just flip who was in power, right? And that isn't actually changing any of the situations, right? And one of the reasons, right, that I theorize that this as a social theorist, but also somebody who is deeply interested in and concerned with uh, how we transform the world that we live in, right? And the success of social movements in doing that. I I am very much interested in what makes a social movement work. What is effective in causing transformation? And one of the things is imagination. If we cannot imagine a wildly different future, if we do not have a vision of what that can possibly look like, regardless of whether it's idealistic or utopian or whatever cynics want to attach to it, if we cannot envision it, there is no way that we can work towards making it possible, right? So what McLean is talking about, kind of like when we were talking about way back in the first couple of weeks when we were reading Shaw and talking about ethnography as something that is potentially revolutionary. What McLean is talking about here is potentially revolutionary. It's certainly revolutionary in the context of anthropological literature, right? It's taking to task our sort of um, some of the best theories currently available, right? It's taking to task those theories. It's reminding us of the context, right? The epistemological context, the historical context of where those ideas come from. And it's pushing our some of our preeminent scholars to think differently, to say, "Hey, you've missed something here. And here's how I think that we fix this." Right? Here's a different approach that I think we should try, right? And so it sort of upends everything, but it also suggests that something radically different is possible. Right? Remembering too, right, that radical doesn't just mean it's not just some boogeyman. Radical means completely different from what we know, right? It means a complete and thorough change. So it's not necessarily something that's negative or bad. Can it be frightening? Sure. sure, it can be frightening. Lots of change is often frightening. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative thing, right? Okay, so how do we do this? I want to spend a little bit of time trying to think through it. So we're going to practice, right? We're going to read this. I'll read it to you. You can read it on your own screen. Let me make sure this is the one that you're seeing. So this was written in 2014. I am going to share this other screen with you. It was written in 2014. And it's all right. So it says here, right? I'm going to suggest an odd thing on the heels of all this pent-up racial strife that's exploding once again on our TV screens and even in some of our neighborhoods. And that is to be thankful that the underlying thing behind all of this, in fact, exists. Not racism, dummy, race. Okay, so the argument here is that race exists. So as we're doing this, I want you to keep in mind what we've read. Keep in mind the arguments, right? And we're going to analyze this a little bit. Also, keep in mind what was happening in 2014, right? So I believe at the date of this publication, this was shortly after, I want to say, hard to believe that Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012. So this was shortly following Michael Brown's death, right? And so this is what the context is of sort of all of this erupting on our TV screens, right? And that was 2014. So that was 6 years ago. So this author is trying to make an impassioned plea, right? Or the simple fact of life that some of us look and do different. Imagine for a moment with me a world without race. Sorry, gotta pull it up again. Right? Imagine for a moment with me a world without race, without that difference, without the color or the culture or the creative rhythms that they give birth to. There would be no Michael Jordan or Michael Jackson or even the Rolling Stones inspired by Muddy Waters. Perhaps the king, a reference to Elvis, himself would never have shaken or shimmied his way into the living rooms of shocked white parents. Certainly he would not have, as most of his work was cribbed from Black artists. There would be no Morgan Freeman or Denzel or Maya Angelou. Breakdancing perhaps wouldn't exist. No one would have ever hipped or hopped or bebopped. We'd never have had the chance to say, "Hey, Willie." There never would have been an Ali to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. There never have been that man who had a dream. What a tragedy the world would be without race. So let's be thankful for race, because being thankful for what is can help us get rid of what should not be. Racial inequality, racial hatred. Imagine a world without race. It would look a whole lot different, wouldn't it? Race without the ism. Well, it's a wonderful thing. Imagine a world without race, and then be thankful that we don't live in it. So that's a take. I'd love to see some of your quick spit takes on that particular poem. And you know what? I'm going to pull it up again just because if we need to go back and reference it, we can do that. But there are a couple of quick things going on in this article, or in this poem, in this plea. So one is a question about the positionality of this author. It seems that this author is very likely not Black. which means that they're speaking from an outside perspective and speaking in a way that tells us that they've not experienced the social effects of race and racism, for one. The other, and I wonder if you notice this, is that people that Michael Jordan, that Michael Jackson, that Morgan Freeman, that Denzel Washington, that Maya Angelou, that Muhammad Ali would not exist if we didn't have a category to put Black people in. Do you think that's true? That this definition, that I would not exist if we could not call me white. That Barack Obama would not exist if we could not call him Black. So we see here, right, with that, a conflation, a huge conflation, right, of race and biology. Right? I am racialized, therefore I exist. Right? It's this sort of really strange and likely unintended, but also really essentialist view of what race is and what race means. And it relies on some really critical assumptions, right? That we would not, right? And it's a little messed up, right? When you first read it, you're like, oh, this is very pie in the sky. Isn't that delightful? But right, like, so there's this insinuation that right, that talent is somehow tied also to racial identities, and typically this has been inverted, right? That there is this assumption that that talents are limited as a result of one's race, right? But there's also this assumption that within this, right, so tying in some of these ideas, some of this representation, some of this essentialism, right, about how certain bodies and people with those certain bodies, right, are assumed to operate in the world, are assumed to um right, what the benefit to white people, their existence is, right? Rather than it being about people existing and being able to exist without fear of extrajudicial killing, right? Right. So something that Black people experience all the time, especially being Black women, people see race before even getting to know me as a person. Absolutely. Right. So there's this sort of automatic barrier. Now there's this other thing, right, that's going on in this right, like the color of the skin is a personality trait, right? And that's kind of that is what this writer is insinuating, that that if there wasn't this racial identity, right, Muhammad Ali would not be Muhammad Ali, and that we would never have witnessed the greatest boxer alive, right? Or Tatiana Ali, for that matter, right? Muhammad Ali's daughter. And so there's this, there are a couple of things, other things happening here as well, right? So this is sort of one of these, like, we can get rid of racism, and it's sort of eschewing the color blindness argument of saying, "Oh, I don't see race," right? Which in and of itself, right, recognizing, so we can do a couple of things without arguing for color blindness. Right. And I don't think McLean is arguing for color blindness. That's far too facile, too simplistic, right? McLean is taking it much, much further than that. But color blindness is a way to ignore the political factors, the historical context, right? The social effects that race and racism have had, right? But on the other hand, this sort of attachment of race as as Priscilla was saying, right, a personality trait is also deeply problematic. It's essentializing in the same ways. It's just essentializing in the same ways on the opposite end of the parabola, right? So looking at the two different extremes, and that is also not helpful, right? It's also limiting in those ways, right? So I found this because I was trying to think of activities and come up with some examples of the ways that yes, I didn't even put that together. I love that song, and its revolutionary sort of callings and idealism. But this is a great point, right? That it's imagine, if you will. Oh, I bet we could probably sing it in that way. I didn't try, but you've given me an idea to make this. I'm not going to sing for you all. Sorry, it's not going to happen. Even to make a point, not today anyway. Yeah, no, I don't think it would work anyway. Good news. But yeah, I mean, I think that those are both. I think those are both great points, right? Is that it's a very it not only is it a bit pipe dreamy, and again, I want to say that being idealistic, having this radical vision for the future, is may seem a bit pipe dreamy, may seem out of reach for some people, but we do have to have this imagination. I would argue, however, that this is a really lazy imagination, that this isn't actually the kind of imagination that is revolutionary. This is like what McLean is arguing about. This is what McLean is taking Omi and Wynant to task for. They're saying, listen, you're imagining this world, but it's a world still within the confines of the world in which we already live. This is not a different world. This is not a better situation. This is perhaps mitigated, but it's still within the confines of this very rotten box, right? And if we're going to change things, we need to actually get out of this rotten box and find somewhere else to be, right? So right, there are ways that we can have revolutionary idealism without it being a different version, right? Without imagining a different version of the same world within the same systems that we already live in, right? So if this is not the world we're imagining, right? Then what will work? What will work? Okay, well, good news, y'all. I've got some options. I don't have some options.
I'm asking you to make a donation right now before the
Lord have mercy. It's election year. All of the ads are All of the ads are political ads. All right. So if you aren't already familiar with this, I highly recommend looking into it. Some of you may already be familiar with this idea, but I want you to think about it in anthropological terms. I want you to think about the value of this as a toolkit for revolutionary thinking, right? Afrofuturism, right, offers a way to imagine a radically different world that is in line with what McLean is talking about, right? And I'm not talking about this in just the fictional context. I'm talking about how do we take the lessons and the ideas from concepts like Afrofuturism and apply them and make them work. Some of the examples that I've provided in the pop culture blog samples do specifically talk about Afrofuturism. There's some great anthropology on Afrofuturism, and a lot of anthropologists of color are actually working through these ideas and these theories intentionally to get at some of the things that authors like McLean are talking about. So I want us to watch this clip. I will undoubtedly have to scrub it from the class video, but the link is up, and so you can use that, or I'll put the link up. Hold on just a second. It won't. I don't think it'll let me copy and paste it here. Copy. Yes. Okay. I'm going to put it in the comments here, but this is just a very, very quick primer on Afrofuturism. And I'm going to share this with you. And then we'll talk about some other, as we have time, we'll talk about some other resources. So I'm going to get my face off here and let you all
mean for Black people to have a future? What does that look like?
In February 2018, Marvel's Black Panther broke box office records and elevated the phrase Afrofuturism to the forefront of the American lexicon. But Afrofuturism is a practice that goes far beyond the aesthetic of Black people donning cool science fiction-y costumes. It is a genre of speculative fiction that highlights what regular science fiction can't and won't.
Greg Tate has spoken about how Black people live the alienation that science fiction writers imagined.
The parallels between Black life and sci-fi storylines are blatant. Despite this, there has been a glaring exclusion of Black people from works of science fiction. As such, one might think that Black people would shy away from speculative fiction and instead opt to focus on the present.
We need to represent Blackness and Black people within every realm. We need to be able to see that imagination is key, and representation has to do with allowing ourselves to be able to let our imaginations take flight, that creative impulse, that's essential.
Afrofuturism is an art form, practice, and methodology that allows Black people to see themselves in the future despite a distressing past and present. It calls upon sci-fi imagery and futuristic ideas to reflect upon the marginalization of Black people. Practitioners conceptualize an array of visions of what a Black future could look like. But what does that look like? We identified 4 unique Afrofuturist artists who have used their work to imagine Black life beyond its current state of global oppression. A 500-year history of colonialism, slavery, racism, and segregation have left people of the African diaspora with a disjointed idea of what it really means to be home.
Always feeling like we ain't from here, this is not our land, this is not our people. Being considered like this thing that's to be feared, like this unknown.
Visual artist and hip-hop MC Jessica Valoris uses speculative fiction and science fiction tropes to encourage people of the African diaspora to phone home. Her piece, named after the famous E.T. line, uses audio soundscapes to allow people to audibly imagine what home might sound like. In her play, Enough VO5 for the Universe, Melanie Goodrow depicts a world 100 years into the future where God is a gender non-binary Black person. It is a vision of the future that celebrates Black queer lives in spite of present-day queer and trans antagonism. A toxic soup of poverty, misogyny, anti-Blackness, and transphobia leave Black transgender women and femmes at an exorbitantly high risk for being murdered.
I thought it was an expansive image of God, to think of God as a man who also can be a woman. We have to expand our ideas of what Black maleness is or Black femaleness is.
The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman.
Black people are often caught in the ironic crosshairs of being hypervisible and invisible. Black women, for example, are often hypersexualized, leaving them at a greater risk for sexual assault and violence. Yet, they have also been largely left out of conversations around sexual violence, even following the rise of 2017's #MeToo movement. Afrofuturist costume designer and cosplayer Delta Major reclaims the narrative of how her body is perceived in the world. She creates clothes that she defines as wearable art, the goal of which are to define her beauty and sexuality on her own terms, whilst incorporating strong shapes and patterns that emphasize physical strength.
I feel like I can totally be in Wakanda, kicking some ass, taking some names.
And while Afrofuturists are hard at work producing art that rethinks the present, some artists use the genre to reimagine the past. In the graphic novel Maddie's Rocket, retro Afrofuturist Tim Fielder imagines a Jim Crow-era heroine named Maddie, who flies rocket ships and fights back against the KKK and aliens with her trusty rifle.
There have always been gun-wielding, Jim Crow fighting Black women. Always. You just never saw that. Retro Afrofuturism is the filling in of those voids through speculative fiction.
Afrofuturism is a pathway to Black liberation. It provides an avenue to be able to transform ourselves and our communities.
The biggest Afrofuturist for me is Harriet Tubman. Like, she had dreams about liberation. She had dreams about freedom.
Black people have been engaging in Afrofuturism well before the term was coined by Mark Derry in 1994. Whether the state of Black life be perilous or prosperous, folks of the African diaspora will continue to imagine expansive ideas of Black life in the past, present, and beyond.
Okay, so that's just a little teensy taste of and sort of overview of some of Afrofuturism. There is so much. Much of Janelle Monáe's music, for example, and work, art, acting, all of those things are Afrofuturist in their sort of makeup, right? For example, Missy Elliott, there was a clip in there of a Missy Elliott music video. Missy Elliott's always been sort of in the Afrofuturist realm as well, right? But the point of it is a way to imagine a radically different future. Now, you'll also have seen, right, that it isn't about reproducing the same power structures, but inverted, right? So it's not about jockeying for power within the same system. It's about a different system altogether, right? A different space in which race is not attached to biology, right? The idea of racism and the idea of race isn't relevant in a space where everyone, right, not just Black, right? Afrofuturism sort of has this it developed because of white supremacy and the global sort of anti-Blackness that it fosters, right? So it doesn't mean that there isn't racism at different towards different identities, right? Different non-Black people of color. But addressing anti-Blackness also addresses racism against non-Black people of color as well, right? And so that's part of the reason that there's such emphasis on anti-Black racism in particular, anti-Blackness in particular. And also, as we've talked about, excuse me, as we've talked about, because it exists everywhere, right? And the colorism that happens within countries that are already identified by whiteness, right, as places of color, right, where people of color live, right, that aren't identified as white spaces initially, right, but where anti-Blackness or, right, shades of darkness determine one's social status and potentially political status, right? So all of those systems, right, are part of the same practices. And this is why, right, the emphasis is on anti-Blackness. Right? It doesn't mean that there aren't other problems happening at the same time, but they are under the same umbrella, right? So if we talk about anti-Blackness, we can and are talking about these other things at the same time. Afrofuturism is also great because it's not just an American concept, right? So it is looking at Blackness around the world. It is looking at Afro, not just African American, but Afro descendants all over the world, and how they are imagining and creating space, right? And really flexing revolutionary imagination for a different world, right? So this is one of the ways in which we can train our brains, train our minds, unlearn the things that we have learned that make this level of imagination difficult, right? That result in these sort of pithy, but ultimately sort of problematic and meaningless poems like the Costa Rica guy wrote. That's the handle name, the Costa Rica guy. For all I know, that's a white dude living as an expat in Costa Rica, which in and of itself has all kinds of problems, y'all. But we'll have to save that for another topic for another day. So this is one of the ways that I think that we can unlearn these systems and how we move forward, right? I do have a tendency to pick articles and readings or to emphasize sort of how things are broken. But I want us to understand, right, what the puzzle is so that we can solve it, right? We have to know what the problem is in order to come up with solutions, to come up with creative solutions. We have to know what the parameters are of the world as it exists, what those barriers are, so that we're not surprised when we come up against them, but so that we can go right through them, right? So that we can dismantle them, right? And so that's, I don't know, I kind of have a backdoor way of unlearning, in which it seems like we focus a lot on the negative, but it's so that we can face head on the problems without ignoring them, but also be fully prepared to weigh the information and then make a plan to shift it and change it, right? Because as it exists, it has very real consequences. As McLean, points out in the article, they want to disentangle race from the body and race from biology and racism with it. But they also recognize that race and racism have very real physical consequences for bodies. Right? As somebody who's trained as a biologist, as somebody who's trained in medical anthropology, McLean knows that exposure to racism can increase negative health effects. It can result in an increase of hypertension and an increase of type 2 diabetes. It can result in early death, right? The reduction of years off one's life, right? It can result in chronic illness. It can result in, and that's not to mention all of the psychological effects that then can also have other physiological effects, right? It can result in chronic stress. Chronic stress then results in poor immune systems and higher incidence of health risks, right? As a medical anthropologist and somebody who works on biological racism, this is something that I confront a lot in my own work and my own research, right? That and the assumptions about what bodies marked in a specific way are assumed to be capable or incapable of, right? Or what they are assumed to have or not have simply by looking at them, right? As Priscilla was pointing out, they're also not just as a personality, skin color is not alone considered just a personality trait in some instances. It's also considered sort of like a genetic marker for what diseases you may or may not have, right? It's like a medical chart, but without actually having ever talked to a person, right? And so these are very, very real consequences. And unless we fundamentally change, right, the systems and the ideas that give birth to these systems. So for McLean, that's settler colonialism, right? This idea that we, as people, any group of people, right, goes in and conquers another group of people, right? Or goes in and displaces another group of people, or goes in and denies, or even if they're, takes power in some place where they're in, and then systematically denies other people, right, the same quality of life that they expect for themselves, the same access to resources, based on these artificial categories that they've made up in order to justify these things. If we cannot imagine a world where that is not possible, how will we ever get to such a world, right? It's not that it's not possible. It's just that we don't know how to imagine it yet. And we have to practice that. We have to work on that. And it's not that not everybody doesn't know how to imagine that. There are examples. There are ways that we can imagine those worlds and what they look like. That's why, for example, that's why I offered you the example of Afrofuturism. There are other ways as well, right? I appreciate one of the articles that I pulled up as an example for you in the blog. Got me in my feels and made some really great points. And I agree with them. But also was picking on some of my favorites, right? And it's not that we can't have our favorites that are problematic, but we have to be open to the criticism of those favorites. We have to be willing to imagine something radically different if we want a different result. Right? So hopefully you'll go through and read some of those examples. I'm going to put those up. Your task for this pop culture blog is not unlike what we've done in class already, but you're going to do it in a written format. You need to use sources that we have been reading in class, right? So this is your chance to apply the theories and the knowledge that we are gleaning from our readings and from lecture and from the examples that we're talking about. But like we did with Childish Gambino's music video, right? Or Kanan's music video. right? Like we did with this poem just now, right? Excuse me, the allergies, y'all. They never go away. That is your task, right? I want you to analyze it. And for this first blog, right, you're going to be analyzing, you're going to be conducting a racial analysis, right? I want you to identify issues of race and racism and representation, right? In whatever way makes sense to you, using the resources that we've been using, right? Is it a good example of this? Is it a bad example of this, and why, right? But I really want you to focus on the analysis, right? And read the examples that I've put up, and it will demonstrate the analysis. It's not just so-and-so says blah, 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 right? So-and-so says racism is bad, right? It's much more involved than that, right? It's Frank Herbert's Dune is an example of settler colonialism, and that is one of its limitations as an example of speculative fiction, right? Science fiction and fantasy. This is how other authors are doing it better, right? This is why that's a problem, and here's how some other authors are doing it better. And here's how that sort of fits in with these grander theories of settler colonialism, of race and racism, of and how it upends epistemological ideas, right, or challenges those. So that's the task, but it's some of the things that we've already been practicing. The one thing I will say, and again, this will be in the instructions, is that you cannot use WAP as a video this week. That will actually be for our second blog post, and that will be specific. This week you get to choose, but it cannot be WAP. That's my only requirement. So thank you all. We're going to end it there. And for Thursday, you're watching Indigenous Eyes on DC. I'm going to see if the ethnographic filmmaker can join us on Thursday. I'm not sure, but it is a possibility. And you're reading the article about Native Americans and eugenics. So we're still talking about this issue of race. We're talking about and we're going to talk a little bit more about representation, and also think about the bio as you're reading that, right? And as you're engaging with it, think about the implications of McLean's article. Think about the implications of biological racism and race being attached to biology, right? As you're reading about this practice of eugenics, and about your ideas, and I also want you to think about, you may want to read it after you watch the film, or just keep it close in mind as you're watching the film, because that film is recent, and Native American scholars and activists and artists are all over that film, telling us about their lived experiences. So I want you to think about that too, right? As we're talking about and as we're thinking about representation, and epistemological violence, linguistic violence, and all of those sorts of things that we've already sort of been building up to. All right. Thank you, everybody. We will see you on Thursday, and I'll see some of you in office hours. And what else? I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.